All right, so we're back for part two of our Chapter 13 lecture, Correctional Professionals, Misconduct and Responses. And if you recall, just a quick kind of review, we talked a little bit about the Zimbardo Stanford study, right? That was super interesting. We talked a little bit about misconduct and corruption, the definitions of misfeasance, malfeasance, and nonfeasance. We even looked at three different states. So we looked at California, Florida, and just a little bit of New York on some of the issues that they have had in the past as it relates to different types of corruption, etc. And then we started to get into or away from talking about the correctional officers, and we started discussing issues related to treatment professionals and even probation and parole. We talked a little bit about the Griffin versus Wisconsin case, which is a really good case study talking about should probation officers partner with law enforcement to search a probationer's house, etc. And then we talked a little bit about, which is where we left off, community corrections. Now, a recent, well, not too recent, but a Dallas, Texas county audit revealed that officers ended up mishandling 70% of cases, not following departmental procedures when handling technical violations. So a lot of issues that happen. So, like the Colorado audit program, which is in your textbook, probation officers did not file violation reports when offenders had things like positive drug tests or didn't pay their fees, etc. Staff members from the probation department basically argue that strict policies regarding violations apply only to certain categories of offenders, and that technical violations must be responded to using discretion and common sense, typically with additional conditions, not violation and revocation. So the audit was requested by a judge who had not been informed of violations such as repeated DUIs, etc. And the judge stated that if she couldn't trust that the probation officers were enforcing the conditions, she would disband that special court, right? And so the auditor's recommendations included some of the things that we're going to talk about. One would be add pertinent emails about cases into the probationer's main file. So these would be some, important things to add in there. Document all appearances by a probationer before a judge. But some recommendations directly to the Texas issue were developing audit forms, probation officers not working from home, updating the probation manual, and even updating training, right? And those kind of make sense as good recommendations in order to deal with some of the technical violations. So some individual explanations that kind of came about, or that come about for misconduct, would be correctional managers attribute misconduct to lower pay and poor screening during hiring. Another explanation or individual explanation of misconduct could be PTSD. And many slide into that corruption bracket because of lack of organizational support for basically ethical behavior, right? So the organization doesn't stand on its own with a good solid foundation in ethics. Additional explanations would be the personal lives of correctional officers influence their professional ethics. The discretion and authority inherent in the role of correctional, probation, or parole officer takes maturity to handle, as well as a strong ethical code. So these are more kind of individual explanations on why you might be seeing some of the things that we've been talking about. And then again, even when you looked at from the military's point of view, just to kind of throw this in there, Iraq's Abu Ghraib prison exposed misconduct, like some of the U.S. prisons where they would have gladiator fights, or um, you know, basically sicking the dogs on the prisoners, or looking the other way while inmates maybe assaulted somebody. So all of these things were taking place there as well. So um, maybe humiliation. Inmates were forced to wear pink as a punishment. Strip searches, or being stripped and having to stand naked, or even wearing a hood. All of these were some things that were found out um, in a military prison as well. All right, so with all of that stuff kind of being said, the question is then, how do we start to address some of it? Well, one of the things that came up, or that continually comes up, would be something called procedural justice. So another useful way to understand prison corruption by staff members is to consider procedural justice research. Now, Tyler's 2006 original work on the importance of believing in the legitimacy of the law has been applied to various elements of the criminal justice system, including that of corrections. And we'll talk a little bit more about what procedural justice means. It includes the idea that the perception of legitimacy of the legal authorities comes about when the elements of procedural justice are present. Treatment is fair. Specifically, things like participation, letting people speak. Neutrality, governing by rules neutrally and consistently, so everybody's treated the same, right? Dignity and respect. And trustworthiness, or to illustrate trustworthiness. So authorities are, sincerely concerned with an inmate's well-being, let's say, okay? So a lot of different things for us to consider when we talk about procedural justice. And, several studies have explored procedural justice principles in corrections, and findings indicate that inmates' perception of procedural justice will lead to a belief in legitimacy of correctional authorities, while feelings of injustice seem to affect recidivism, meaning that people, end up recidivating or being involved in crime again. And in another study, prisoners who believed in a kind of just world, if you will, expressed less anger, reported greater well-being, and were less likely to have problem behavior even after controlling for, criminal and personal backgrounds. So, and one Dutch study, just to finish it out, found that inmates perceived more procedural justice was present in units where correctional officers were more likely to be female, had more favorable attitudes towards rehabilitation, and where there was a higher officer to inmate ratio. So, just as with police organizations, correctional officers also perceive varying levels of procedural justice in their organizations relative to how they are treated by management, right? So we do have to kind of understand all of this. So what about the societal explanations? So as mentioned earlier, the community helps to create the correctional environment by their tacit or direct endorsement of the informal subculture norm that inmates deserve less due process and legal protection than the rest of us. And when juries acquit correctional officers solely because the victim of a beating, let's say, was an inmate, this endorsement reinforces unethical subculture norms, which means it becomes the norm, right? And so, when criminal correctional officers are not prosecuted, and simply fired, it does provide the message that there are a few costs involved in getting involved in some type of misconduct. So it's kind of a little bit of a double standard. And if society wants an ethical correctional system, then we must demand it and expect that even murderers will be treated according to the law. There is no ethical or legal justification for punishment that is not the product of formal due process and restrained by legal guidelines, regardless of what the inmate has done. No ethical system supports this type of conduct, even under utilitarianism. The cost to justice and due process is just too high. So again, these are things that we can do to kind of fix the system, if you will. So what are some of the responses then to corruption? Things that we might be able to fix. So, correctional managers can and should generate a strong anti-corruption policy. Obviously they shouldn't be involved in this in the first place or engaging in any of this themselves. But if, such a policy, if created, should include things like proactive measures, such as mechanisms to investigate and detect wrongdoing, reduced opportunities for corruption, screening of employees using, state-of-the-art psychological tools or testing, improved working conditions, providing good role models in the form of supervisors and administrators who follow the appropriate code of ethics. Now, the Commission on Safety and Abuse in American Prisons has developed a comprehensive list of recommendations to reduce the culture of violence. And this includes things like improving staffing levels, hiring and training, provide independent oversight for complaints and investigations of misconduct, create a national database of violent incidents of misconduct, increase access to the courts by repealing or amending the Prison Litigation Reform Act, increase the level of criminal prosecution of wrongdoers, perhaps using federal prosecutors, and strengthen professional standards. These are all things that are certainly important. And again, these are things that are developed by the Commission of Safety and Abuse in American Prisons. Now, Sorial in 2009 believed that the following have an influence as well. Okay, because in this particular paper, this author discusses the civility of a correctional institution being as influenced by the level of education required for hire, the amount of in-service training officers receive, the policies regarding employees who act in unethical ways, and the agency's practices. So, these are all things that this author believes would, that fall under the umbrella of civility of a correctional institution. And then another author, Wright, in 2001, offers 7 principles as a guide for how administrators and supervisors should treat their employees. So we're not talking about guards treating an inmate, we're talking about supervisors and employees. So things like safety, fair treatment, due process, freedom of expression, privacy, participation in decision making, and information. So these are the 7 things that were brought forth by Wright in his 2001 article. And then finally, Burrell in 2000 suggests methods or some methods relating to probation, and propose that these are necessary to prevent stress and burnout, etc. So probation and parole organizations should provide clear direction, manage proactively, establish priorities if there are high cases or workloads. Ensure stability and consistency, and be consistent in your expectations. Manage with fairness, enforce accountability, delegate authority, provide proper resources, maintain communication, and allow participative decision making, meaning that everybody gets, a chance to be involved in the conversation, etc. And then to kind of wrap it up, Barrier et al., meaning there are other authors, in 1990 discussed ethics training programs with corrections officers, and that basically that these are things that should take place. So treating all staff fairly and impartially, promoting based on merit, showing no prejudice, leading by example, developing a clear mission statement that people can follow, creating a positive code of ethics, a list of do's rather than don'ts, right? These are things that we want to do, not, hey, these are things that you shouldn't do. Creating a culture that promotes performance, not seniority. Soliciting staff input on new policies, being respectful, and letting the word out that upper management cares about ethics. So these are all important aspects, that are brought forth as it relates to responses to corruption. Okay, so, we're talking now for a second a new era, procedural justice or, restorative justice. Keep in mind that, America has one of the world's highest rates of incarceration. And high recidivism rates suggest that prisons and other deterrence mechanisms, are not particularly effective in reducing crime. And because of that, some advocate for a new approach to crime and punishment, which, kind of like, if things aren't working, is there really something else, that we need to do? And if you recall from chapter 11, that there seems to be a new vision of corrections that is kind of permeating legislatures, advocates, and government agencies. There's kind of a growing realization that this country, again, incarcerates way too many people, and that the prisons are basically warehouses, right? Not places of reform. And if such a shift is strong enough to, break through the culture of corrections, then we might see fundamental changes in the ethics and expectations for correctional officers and other correctional professionals. Now, once again, it's important to note that most professionals perform their job, ethically, with integrity. What might be the result of a cultural shift is that they will feel more supported in their adherence to the ethical standards of behavior. So the principles of procedural justice seem to show the most promise in reforming prison culture. If correctional officers are managed, under the principles of, fairness, voice, respect, and neutrality and trustworthiness, as described, kind of in our earlier section we covered, then there will be more likely, or they would be more likely perhaps, to treat prisoners in that same way, right? And this approach can be described as what we call evidence-based, in that there are research findings that show supervising people under these principles does achieve a behavioral change. So, part of what we're trying to get away from is kind of the industrial complex of prisons, if you will. Prisons do provide jobs and profits to legions of companies and people. And a major shift, again, in the ideology of punishment may have been spurred by the economic burden that penal harm area has generated. The cost of imprisoning so many people simply can't be sustained. However, there is also a moral element in that many advocates consider that the pendulum has swung too far towards severe prison terms, especially for drug offenders. So maybe we're seeing kind of a little bit of a change. And that brings us to a topic called peacemaking corrections. And this type of corrections offers an approach of care and kind of whole sight, or looking at what needs to be done with both kind of the heart and the head. Both restorative justice and peacemaking corrections are consistent with the ethics of care model. And while it might be considered, kind of feminine models of justice because of the emphasis on the needs rather than retribution, programs under this basically rubric of restorative justice include things like sentencing circles, family counseling, and victim, offender mediation. So these are all different types of corrections. So peacemaking corrections is different because it's an approach to corrections that depends on care, okay? Not necessarily just punishment, right? So again, kind of an interesting thing for us to look at. All right, so that was a lot to cover. There were a lot of different definitions in there. And again, as I mentioned at the outset of this lecture, the majority of corrections officers are fabulous, hardworking individuals that do their job with integrity and ethics. But we know that not all of them are like that, right? We know that we do have some issues that we kind of have to deal with. So, kind of as we wrap up, remember in this chapter, we examined different forms of misconduct by correctional professionals. And we see that research has indicated the very nature of a prison may encourage an abuse of power. And it was also noted that much of the misconduct may occur because of the, informal subculture and a loss of a sense of mission by professionals, as well as even poor management, right? Lack of resources. Now, responses to ethical misconduct and corruption and corrections kind of lag behind the efforts of those in law enforcement. Suggestions include, ethics training and improving management. Procedural justice research, remember, shows that if authorities practice things like fairness and neutrality and the other elements of procedural justice, there is more faith and compliance with the rules. And this concept applies to prisoners and correctional officers equally. Restorative justice principles may help to improve the sense of mission and commitment to ethical behavior by correctional workers, but, legality should be the overriding theme of corrections as well as law enforcement. So regardless of what offenders have done, remember they are still protected by the law. And correctional professionals who agree with that premise are definitely more likely to conduct themselves in the ethical manner that we know that they can. So with that being said, that will wrap up part 2 of our chapter 13 lecture on correctional professionals, misconduct, and responses.